Hi, folks, and welcome to this podcast today. I'm with Dr. Charles Maxfield, who is writing a couple of books for Santos Books. And Charles, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
I go by Chuck Maxfield usually. I'm a United Church of Christ pastor, ordained in 1970. I also have a doctorate in church history from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Besides pastoring churches, I've taught in college, world history, and have directed lay ministry training in a couple of different states in the United Church of Christ, and also with other denominations as well. And so that's part of my passions.
Chuck, why don't you talk about your forthcoming book? It should be out any day, published by Santos Books. Tell us its title and its background, how you connect with this book.
Yeah, Germanness on Trial, the German Evangelical Synod of North America, and the Espionage Act of 1917. It's about war fever, about what happens when a country has to propagandize its country to hate its enemy in war, and that hatred gets transferred to people of the ethnic group, uh, which is the ethnic group of the enemy, but who are loyal Americans as well.
Mhm.
It's looking at a particular case, a small German, ethnically German denomination in the United States, the Evangelical Synod, and what happens to their pastors, what happens to their church during the tsunami of war fever in 1917, 1918. It's not all that dissimilar from what happens to the Japanese in World War II, what happens to some Iraqis and other Muslims during the Iraq War. But this is a focus on one particular instance, one particular crisis example of this war fever and how it affects the German Evangelical Synod of North America.
Chuck, could you tell us a little bit about the German Evangelical Synod? What group are we talking about here, and where did they come from? And yeah, a little about their history.
Today, through mergers, they're part of the United Church of Christ. They were churches organized primarily with German or continental missionary societies amongst German settlers in the United States, beginning in the middle of the 19th century. They, in some ways, identified with the Church of the Prussian Union, that is, the Kaiser's church, although they were not organically related to it. And I think that's a summary of what they were in this country. Not a large denomination.
Was their experience, because they came from the Kaiser's church, was their experience of being German in 1917 as Americans different than that of other Germans? Or would they all face the same struggle?
It was the same, but more so. Let me put it that way. Um, Germans who had been in this country for generations did not necessarily face the same persecution as those who were born in Germany and in most cases naturalized American citizens. Um, I think that there were well, let's look back at 1917, 1918. Um, some streets had their names changed. Towns had their name changed because they were German. Orchestras would not play music by German composers. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage, I think it was what it was called. German was dropped from the curriculum in high schools. There was an overriding anti-German feeling aroused in this country as we sought to build up a hatred of the enemy, Germany, in order to justify putting our young men in harm's way to fight them. And so it was something that was affecting all Germans, but particularly those who were born in Germany, and it came particularly hard on the Evangelical Synod.
What was the Evangelical Synod response to this, formally and also informally on the ground?
The German Evangelical Synod like many immigrant churches, had a division between the old timers who liked to be German and the younger Americanizers who want to be more American. But amongst the Americanizers, the Evangelical Synod, there was a tension between two schools of thought. Reinhold Niebuhr, head of the War Welfare Commission, wanted his church to be fully 100% American and fully behind the war and the war efforts. Julius Horstmann, the editor of the newspaper, the weekly parish paper, um, really didn't like war. He thought it was a terrible, unchristian thing and could not fully get behind the war effort, although he would be loyal to his country. And so that was a tension that was being lived out in the Evangelical Synod. My book, the first part, deals with trials, with two particular trials of German pastors who were accused of, on the Espionage Act, of undermining the efforts of this country. The second part deals with the struggle within the Evangelical Synod to try to come to terms with this crisis, the tsunami that was hitting them, and the tensions within the Synod and how it tried to respond to them.
What kinds of things happened to Germans during this time? I mean, you talked about food being changed, names changed, streets changed. Was there personal suffering that was experienced?
Well, if you were perceived as a coward in any way, which is easy to do if you're a German, you could have your front door painted yellow. Um, One pastor was taken by a mob and set on top of a casket representing the Kaiser and paraded down the main street and required to kiss the flag. Another pastor had similar experiences where they were supposedly forcing him to salute the flag, not that he wouldn't do it, and whose church was burned down by some anti-German people in town. So yeah, there were personal effects felt all around.
How did you get interested in this topic, Chuck?
Well, I started out, I was teaching lay pastors about the history of the United Church of Christ. And I didn't have one book to use. There's no one volume that summarizes it all. And so I took a sabbatical and wrote a book, which is my other book that will be coming out, A Pilgrim People, A History of the United Church of Christ and Its Antecedents. And in doing the research, I became aware of this story. And it's not in its entirety in that volume, I just touch on it, but wanted to go deeper into that story. And around 2002, when there was a lot of anti-Iraqi and anti-Muslim feeling in this country, I thought, it's 1917 all over again. And somehow we need to be reminded of this story that happened. I want members of my denomination, the United Church of Christ, to know this story as part of our story. I want people who are ethnically German to understand when we're being whipped up to feel hatred towards some group, that we've been on the receiving end of that hatred, and that that should give us a bit more sympathy towards those who are undergoing it. And I think anyone concerned with civil liberties, which should be all of us, should be concerned about how somehow in the excitement and antagonism of war, that those things are swept aside, whether it be by vigilantes or by what happens in the courtroom. And I think we really need to be aware of that and to stand up for our civil liberties.
So, Chuck, what is the relevancy of this book? One that I would have to say to readers is very carefully documented. You were very intentional about the documentation of that and citing sources. Maybe you could say something about that, why that's so important, but also what is the relevancy of this story to our world today?
Well, we are not at war today, but there is a intentionality of demonizing certain groups. to be more specific, immigrants or even illegal immigrants are not all drug dealers. They are not eating our cats and dogs. They are building our houses. They are sweeping, mopping our floors. They are working hard as a part of this country. And I think that's part of the relevance of it. But it's a relevance that has to be maintained all the time as we look at ways in which different groups are demonized and the repercussions that can have on people who are quite totally innocent of crimes or of doing harm to this country.
Chuck, this is the first book that's coming out under the Santos name by an author who's not Walter Brueggemann. And I'm delighted that it deals with something that's sensitive to justice and issues of justice the way that it is. It will be followed by another book that looks at the Cuban crisis and resistance to Castro. So I'm delighted with books that look at these issues in ways that are historical but so relevant for today. You were careful to document the sources you used, and I've heard you argue why that was so important.
Yes, particularly when you look at the transcripts of trials, which are like a script, where you see the interaction of persons, and you try and get a feeling into what's going on inside of them, whether it be the person charged or the attorney or the judge. You get the feeling of what's going on them. And I guess I'd say to any reader, if you can read this and imagine yourself on one of the juries of these trials, if you can find one iota of reason for charging guilty, I would be amazed, because every bit of documentation is there. The criticisms that were reported to the Bureau of Investigation, the reports of what the investigators did when they went out to these communities to listen and find out what's happening, the charges that were made, the testimony of the trials. Let's spell it all out and see where is the crime, what was done that was in any way destructive to the security of the United States.
Germanness on Trial. It can be purchased shortly, within the week, I think, on Amazon. Should be up. And Charles, Chuck will have copies. I'll have copies at my website. And I encourage you to purchase this. I think it's fairly inexpensive. I think $10, Chuck, and so I'm delighted by that also. And there is a second book coming out. Do you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, it's of particular interest to people in the United Church of Christ, but I think others are interested in church history in general. The United Church of Christ is a union of 4 different groups, at least, amongst many others that have wandered in, been part of it. And to teach it, there's no one volume that teaches it. As one who was responsible for teaching it, I had to use 6 books. Yeah. And you can't require 6 books from people on a lay ministry program, which is a 20-hour course. And so I wanted to put it together to tell one story, one whole integrated story of this particular church, which is my church, the church about which I care very much.
So that, folks, will be coming out later this year, about the middle of the year. Thank you, Chuck, for being part of the Santos team and for writing using your creative gifts. And we look forward to reading more of what you're doing. Thanks so much.
Well,
and
thank you very
to
much for being able to help publish these things. I appreciate it.
You bet. You bet.
Thank
Bye.
you.